Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with David O. Stewart, the author of The Democracy We Must Keep: 7 Founders, 9 Documents, and the Ideas That Shaped America. He's written 11 books, which include narrative and historical fiction, and is also an attorney. Thanks so much for being here, David.
Thanks. It's a treat to be here.
I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And also, AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work when you get a chance. You quote one modern president in your prologue, and that is Ronald Reagan. He agreed with Congress to pay reparations to Japanese Americans. As you point out, they were forced into prison camps during World War II. And he said in this quote that you pulled out, "America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal, not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background. We have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way." So, David, if it wasn't race, religion, or even national origin that would define an American, at least in its stated terms, what was it? What ideals did the founding generation say that we should build our national identity on?
Well, you can sort of break it down 2 ways. There were the sort of norms of the time, which they rejected, which is that there should be one man rule. Monarchies and empires were the order of the day in the 18th century. And they really thought, as Thomas Paine put it, that that was insulting. No, it meant that everybody in the country was inferior to the king, and it seemed ridiculous. But they also embraced very positive ideals, which are really the flip side of that, which is every person has value, and that every person should be able to participate. Now, they defined it a bit narrowly in the early days, and we've had to.
Yeah, I'll say, yeah.
But that was the principle. And, you know, what Reagan was getting at was we all came here, or our ancestors came here from somewhere else, except for the Indians. And, they're not that big a part of the population these days. And they came for reasons. One of the reasons was opportunity, absolutely. But a big reason was who we are, our ideals, our words, our principles. And that was appealing. And, people went through terrible hardships to get here. I know my ancestors did. And, it wasn't all peaches and cream when they got here. There were hard times. Certainly those Japanese Americans could talk about that. But those goals set us apart. They've been copied many times since by other countries. But we really have the distinction of being the first people who really embrace that. And that defines us, and it has to define us.
One of the things that you acknowledge early in your book is one of the points you just made here is that the founding was rife with the contradictions. We've gone over them on this show a million times. Clearly, race would have an impact. Gender would have an impact. Wealth would have an impact. And people who were declaring that all men were created equal, and many of them are featured in your book, they knew they were being inconsistent in what they said versus what was actually happening. Does that make them frauds and invalidate their public declarations?
You can play that game if you want to, but it makes them pretty human. We're all don't always live up to our ideals every minute. One of the exercises I like to ask people to go through is, what do we do today that people 300 years from now are going to say, how could they do that? How could they keep burning coal when they knew it was poisoning everything? How could they eat animals? we know animals have a consciousness. Why were they eating them? Um, but you know, traditions, conventions, uh, just momentum
Right. I
of
mean, there are people starving right down both of our streets
right,
probably right now.
yeah, and and we make very small efforts to help them. And so, life is complicated. We're not as good as we are. One of the qualities of the founding fathers and uh, was they really thought human beings were deeply flawed and needed to be controlled and cajoled and coerced to do good things. They really understood that we have bad qualities. We're greedy, we lie, we cheat, we want power, and those are people you can't really trust. And that's the kind of government they built that doesn't trust people. It wants them to be controlled by other people.
You say that this book responds to the times that we're currently living in. Without getting too edgy here, what are you seeing that the founders might have something to say about?
Well, I think that there's the tone of the times, which is pretty corrosive. We have, just an insult world these days, and it's difficult, it's wrong, uh, and it makes everything harder. We also are living with chaos in from above. It's with tariffs, it's with our immigration policy. Things just change all the time, and it is unsettling, and it is not what are the hallmarks of good government. And I think I wrote this book because it was disturbing me. And I think there are a lot of Americans out there on both sides of the political aisle who are disturbed by these factors.
One of the things that I love about the way you set this book up is that you put in really plain language. And sometimes historians don't do this. They go round and round in circles, or they make you read to get to the point. But you state very clearly as to what set the British mother country and the American colonies on this path of destruction. And that is that the British expected, that the colonists should be fiscally responsible for the war that the British had on the American continent.
Yeah, we uh, we were a little bit cute in the way we argued it. We, claimed that it was the fact that it was being imposed from Britain and it wasn't our own people who were enacting the tax laws. And in fact, there was a tradition of our colonial assemblies managing the taxes that were laid on Americans. And Americans had lower taxes than most British people. Uh, but we also, it's a constant in American society and human society. We don't like paying taxes, and that was part of what was going on.
At what point does this conflict start to get uncontrollable?
It was a long slide. It took 10 years, and it required both sides to get angry, and that's how you get an argument. And the British would try some new initiative, and then the Americans would throw a fit, and the British would back off, and then they'd come up with some other thing to annoy the Americans, and we'd throw another fit. And it went back and forth in slow motion because, you know, communication was so slow in those days. And, ultimately, nobody wanted to make up. There
In,
was an appetite for fighting.
in your view, was this a fight over finances, or had the two cultures had the cultures diverged in such a way where the American colonists were forging their own identity, even aside from the fiscal requirements being put on them?
Yeah, you make a good point. I think there was a different culture growing here. There was a reform movement in Britain at the time, which took a while to ripen and ultimately did improve and basically defang the monarchy. Uh, but there also was an argument which we tend not to pay much attention to, but probably should, over land, the land out past the Appalachians, the Western lands, which the British wanted the Americans just to stay where they were and not try to expand because it angered and unsettled the Indians for good reason, because we would go out and take their land. But the Americans really wanted to move, and this was rich people wanted to do it because they wanted to speculate in those lands out west, and poor people wanted to do it because they wanted to move there and get a fresh start. And so that was a factor, and it motivated both sides.
How did the colonists begin to use documents to organize themselves?
Well, it was a few steps. They began to adopt resolutions opposing each of the measures the British were imposing. They would circulate them. They would send them back to Parliament as petitions, and try to get redress from the British. And we started getting connections between the colonies. They had been pretty independent of each other, pretty freestanding. It was hard. A lot of people never left their home community more than 30 miles in their whole lives. But they recognized that they had this shared issue, and it was shared. So they began reaching out. The committees of correspondence would be in touch with each other. They had these associations they formed in order to boycott British trade. They thought if they could hit the British in the pocketbook, that would make a big difference. And it annoyed the British plenty.
You settled on 7 founders to profile here, and you guide us through the key documents that they authored. This is a short book. It's under 100 pages, but I think it's useful in that it really highlights the important things, and you kind of guide the reader through in almost an annotated fashion about the documents that you say set America on its path to creation. The 7 founders that we see here in the book are Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, excuse me, my voice is struggling today, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Gouverneur Morris, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. After studying them, did you find something that they all had in common about their formative years that would make them great and important patriots, even though their backgrounds are very different?
That's a great question. They came from a range of backgrounds, but not only a couple came from great wealth. Madison's family was very well off. Gouverneur Morris's family was very well off. Jefferson's was. So there you have 3, but the others were not. I mean, Washington had to make his own money, or marry it, which he did. Which was a very smart move.
Now it's our money.
Right. Now it became his. And then, obviously Hamilton came from nothing. And Thomas Paine had a very simple background. So it was a mix of backgrounds. What they all were was ambitious. They were ambitious to leave a mark on the world, and very engaged with what was going on at the time.
What was it about the way media worked in those days that made documents particularly useful in organizing a revolution? How did all these ideas that they have get distributed?
Yeah, again, that is a great question, because, today, we have memes that go viral in, 80
Matter
minutes.
of seconds. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then, it took 4 weeks for mail to get from one place to the other within the colonies, and then getting to England was 3 or 4 months. So it was much slower. something that struck me when I first started working in this area was I would go to some rich man's house, like George Mason, and he would have his books there, and it wasn't many. It was, books were precious, and they only had, I don't know, he had maybe 100 books, 150, but he really read them. We don't read them that carefully anymore. And then he would reread them and he would think about them and talk about them with his friends. And it was a slower time, a more deliberative time. And I think that is a characteristic that really uh, defined them. They really had thought deeply about the problems they were going to face in creating this new form of government. And it's something, we're everybody talks about our attention deficit disorder, and we've got it. And uh, it is something that we've lost. And I know I do too. If I work for 2 hours, I have to look at my email and what's going on out there, and
Yeah.
doesn't make us smarter.
How did speeches work versus a printed piece? How did they start to use speeches as opposed to sending something around that would go from newspaper to newspaper to newspaper over the course of a few weeks or months?
Yeah, things circulated by hand, and speeches, they only had an impact if they were picked up by newspapers or circulated by some public uh, uh, emanation, if they printed up by some government. And we were a more literate society than many in Europe, but there were plenty of people here who were not literate. And so it became an oral culture where speeches and documents were read. They would often, newspapers and other things would be left in inns and barrooms, which were major social settings, and people would read them. That's not whoever could read would read them to other people. And one of the images I love of the period is when there was something official like the Declaration of Independence, it would be read, Washington had it read to the troops. He made them stand there and listen to the whole thing. It only takes 20 minutes or so, but it was a way to tell them that this would have official readings of these new documents. So the ideas traveled slowly, and they were talked about. And you see, they traveled in social settings too. They weren't just sitting at their computer and looking at the screen.
Mm.
They were with other people. And if someone's reading Common Sense to you, and Thomas Paine gets off a good one against the king, everybody would laugh. And it became a shared experience.
I want to ask about you before we get to the crux of the book here. I want to ask about how you put this all together. You've done George Washington, you've done James Madison, you've done Andrew Johnson. How did your other books lead you here to this one?
What do I have to offer? And what I have to offer is I've spent 20 years reading and thinking about these people in these documents. And, not that many people have done that. And so I could create a curated list. That's a popular term these days, but what I think are the important parts of it, of our heritage from that era. And it's an incredibly fertile, important era, and share that. And, you point out correctly, it's a short book. I meant it to be a short book. I wanted it to be a book that people actually finished once they started it. There are no footnotes, no endnotes. I left all the scholarly apparatus out. All those documents, you can read them yourself. Although we have the Declaration and the Constitution in the back, just because everybody should have them close at hand. And I wanted to share that, and to provide, act as a guide a bit to the parts I think are important.
Talk about that. In your view, why should we have the Declaration and Constitution close at hand? How important of a point is that? A professor once made it to me, oh my gosh, about 25 years ago now. Why, in your view, do you think it's important that we treat these not just as the country's constitution, but our constitution?
It's that they're distillations of the aspirations of the people who founded this new idea for a nation. Formal declarations of independence were not the standard. A turnover in government would, in the 18th century, would be, some powerful person would seize power and keep it. So this was a whole new way of imagining self-government and the whole idea of self-government. And we'll get into it, I hope, in Washington's farewell. He talks about the potential, with great foreboding, about the potential loss of self-government in this country. And he describes how that could happen in a very haunting way. And that seems to me something we have to understand, that we can fumble this thing and that we have to care for it. And that's how I, derived the title of the book, The Democracy We Must Keep. It's up to us.
Why are big round numbers like 250 a good occasion to do a book and have a reflection like this?
They're landmarks. When they were debating the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, a couple of the delegates said, if this thing lasts for 50 years, it'll be a miracle. Because they were seeing how the sausage was being made. They thought it was a pretty messy process. And everybody at the end didn't like the Constitution. All the people who'd written it, criticisms of it. So they're milestones. It's why did we spend in the last couple of years? And why there are certain birthdays when people say, "Holy cow, how did I get that old?" It's a very human thing.
I was shocked that you've written historical fiction as well. I read your impeached book about Andrew Johnson many years ago, potentially in 2010 or 2011. I didn't realize you had a whole historical fiction career as well. How does doing history for you differ from doing historical fiction?
It's a bit less fun. When you're writing a novel, a friend of mine once distilled this as, the problem whenever you're writing a book is what happens next. And when you're writing a novel, you just sit there and think it up. And if you're writing straight history, yeah, you got to go find it. And, you can't make it up. So it takes longer, considerably longer. And there are rules. You have to be careful about what you quote. And if, it's very frequent that there are alternative explanations for things. And you have to be clear about why you embrace one explanation or why you accept one account. People, a lot of times we're dealing with memories that people have 10, 15, 20 years after the fact. And we know they're unreliable. I mean, our memories are unreliable. So you have to kind of think, well, who was he talking to? Was he trying to make himself sound better? Do we trust the person who wrote it down? So, and in fiction, it's okay. You can just go with whatever feels right to you. And that is a criterion that still applies in narrative nonfiction, but there are a lot of other considerations too.
Did you use any sources for this that went beyond the documents themselves?
There were some facts I had to check. I didn't trust my memory. I've done 5 books set in this time period in America, so I knew what I was going to, the events I was going to cover, but I didn't want to get the wrong date or say something that people love to find mistakes, and there are mistakes in everything, and so you do your best to avoid those.
All right, let's go to the documents themselves. Let's start with Patrick Henry. You say that he posed the ultimate challenge to tyranny, one that blazed through the American colonies like wildfire. People pledged to die for liberty are difficult to oppress. How did he do that? What did he say?
he approached the problem first very logically. And, he was a brilliant trial lawyer. And when you're trying, I tried cases for a bunch of years. When you're in front of a judge or a jury, you have to make sense. And if you say something that doesn't follow from what you said before or is inconsistent, you lose credibility, you're in trouble. And so he knew he had to be careful about that. So he dealt with a crisis that was before the Americans. This is when, following the Boston Tea Party, the British really clamped down on Massachusetts colony. They just eliminated their colonial government. They shut down their harbor. And they sent troops. I mean, it was a real hard-knuckled, bare-knuckled clamp down. And he works through that. And what does this mean? We keep asking the British politely to be fair to us. Is somebody who's sending troops and fleets going to be fair to us? Or isn't that what a tyrant does? And that led him to that final pledge, which really redeems all the talk. I mean, there's always a reaction when somebody's being a firebrand. Well, how about putting your life on the line too, bucko? And he did it. He said, give me liberty or give me death. He actually acted as a military officer for a short period. He knew nothing about it, so he got out of that business quickly. He was a much better politician than a military figure.
And I didn't realize that where he gave that speech, someone said, I'm going to be buried. I'm going to be buried here. And he's still buried there. Edward Carrington. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I had read the story. So when I went to the church, there were guides, of course, the fellow who runs the place. And I said, you got to show me Carrington's place. And it's a real place of honor right outside the window. It was a hot day, and I think it was June. And so they had the windows open. And Henry was a great orator, so he had to have a strong voice in those days. There was no amplification. And so Carrington was young, and he just got swept away. Henry was good. And he said, I want to be buried here. And then 40 years later, when he dies, they buried him there.
I love it. What an American hero. Thomas Paine and common sense. We've all heard about common sense. Tell us what common sense is and what he wrote.
Common sense is maybe a perfect piece of propaganda, which doesn't mean it's perfect. There are some passages you could fiddle with. But he was a fiery guy. He had a great flair for language. He stayed away from a lot of fancy talk. And again, he was logical. And he used arguments that appealed to people. I was struck by the innovative arguments he used that had not been made in the debates among the politicians. So I give him a lot of credit for that. He went to the Bible. He went to English history.
And what did he say?
Well, he said, okay, they say there's a divine right of kings. Let's see what the good book says about it. And it's ironic that he did it because he was an atheist himself. He didn't believe in any of it, but he went to the books of Kings. In the Old Testament, there are 2 books of Kings, and he counted up the kings, and there were 40 of them. And he looked at how they were presented, and those who wrote the Bible portrayed 33 of those, more than 3/4 of them, as evil. So he said, well, if the Bible tells us kings are evil, why do we want them? And then he did the same thing with British history. He took 400 years of it within the same monarchy with some genetic variations had been ruling in Britain. And, everybody was saying we must cling to this wonderful tradition of the British kings. And he said, in these hundreds of years, we've had 8 civil wars and 19 rebellions. I mean, what's good about this? And clearly, nobody likes it.
He was a tax collector, which gave him a unique view as to how much taxes were pissing people off.
Yeah. Well, and he was a failed tax collector, which was
Even
not so
worse.
easy. Um, but he got drummed out of the service. And he was a rabble rouser as a tax collector. He tried to organize the other tax collectors to get better treatment from the king, which it didn't work. So he certainly understood, what taxes are where government meets the rubber meets the road for government, and if people don't pay their taxes, you don't have government.
All right, Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration. Where did he get the key phrase "all men are created equal" from?
Well, it's something of a plagiarized phrase. George Mason, who was a very smart guy, uh, had just produced the Virginia Declaration of Rights, uh, and it was printed in the Philadelphia newspaper in the middle of June. And you can put Mason's opening paragraph against Jefferson's, and it's the same points, not word for word, but it is the same ideas in each sentence. Frankly, each sentence is tracked. But we've forgiven Jefferson for this plagiarism because his is so much smoother. It's so much better written. I mean, it's really good. And that makes a difference. Mason's it's a little like chewing steel wool. It's hard to get through. And Jefferson's goes down very cleanly. So, and those ideas were not brand new. They had been circulating in sort of highfalutin circles in Europe and in America, but nobody has said it better.
You said that there was cut and paste in the Declaration. Should he have done as you did here, an annotated version of it?
Uh, no, although he was so annoyed by the edits that his fellow delegates imposed, mostly on the back half of the Declaration, that he sent to 5 friends copies. He paid to have copied his original first draft, so they could compare it to the final declaration and see how wonderful his was in comparison. Which is a pretty pissy thing to do. He's undercutting his fellow delegates. But he was a little authors can be difficult. So he cared a great deal about the language, and he took a lot of pride in it, and I understand that.
Thomas Jeffer. I'm sorry. The Constitution. Excuse me. My voice is all messed up today. The Constitution. Why did George Washington say it was necessary? We have this idea that James Madison is the father of the Constitution, and maybe he is, but the brainchild of it at some level came from George Washington, who said what we have right now on this continent is just not working.
Yeah, he was the guy. He'd won the war, and we can all argue about whether he really did, but everybody thought he had won the war. And he was the great figure, and he won incredible loyalty from people by giving up power. At the end of the war, he could have made himself king, and instead he went home. He resigned, went home to be a farmer. So he grows alarmed at how bad things are after the war. We have this what I tend to call the day two problem. Day one you fight the war and you're all gung ho and it all looks great, and then day two, how do you end the war? We're kind of having this problem in Iran, and it's not a small problem. And we had a country that was very poor, that had suffered greatly during the war. There was tremendous unemployment. That a lot of loyalists who tended to be rich left, taking a lot of capital. The states were fighting with each other. We had a government under the Articles of Confederation that was incredibly weak on purpose. Americans didn't want a strong central government because they'd seen one in the British Empire and they didn't like it. But it turned out they overdid it and they went to another extreme with the government that couldn't do anything. And Washington made it clear to his circle, which are all the, frankly, the influential people in the country, that he thought we were going down the drain. And he agreed something had to be done. He had to be coaxed into going to the Constitutional Convention. But if he hadn't been there, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have worked.
How did they determine the basics? An executive, two branches of a legislature, and then a Supreme Court and a judicial branch. How did they and who defined all that?
That was the blueprint that was presented by the Virginia delegation, goaded by Madison and Washington. They were the leading figures in that delegation. Edmund Randolph was also another prominent figure, along with Mason. But that was in the air. You know, by the time they met, Americans had written 15 constitutions, 14 state constitutions, and the Articles of Confederation. And now the articles were a botch, but you know, we learned that was a bad idea. And the state constitutions, many had some of these qualities. Either, you know, three branches of government or a bicameral legislature. They tended to have pretty weak executives, but Washington was pretty clear he thought the executive had to have some power. And when they got together, they had the luxury of picking and choosing. And, you know, the debates, and this is how I started in this book writing activity, was writing about the Constitutional Convention. And, you know, they really did a remarkable job of putting together something that had plenty of flaws, but has lasted.
When it comes to the effort to turn the country into something more than this idea, than these ideas, and to take the Constitution and put it into practice, what role did the Federalist Papers play with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton?
Yeah, that was again intended as a propaganda piece. They wanted to persuade people who were going to the state ratification conventions to vote for the Constitution, and there was controversy over it. A lot of people were opposing it, saying it was too central, too much power in a central government. But we have to acknowledge that the circulation of these papers, and I highlight them because I think they're actually brilliant, but we can't really prove that very many people read them. They were in all the New York papers. A handful appeared in a Richmond paper. A handful appeared in a Philadelphia paper. I think the Boston paper had a few. There was a bound edition made of them, which we can track, I don't know, 10 or 12 that got circulated. George Washington passed out some to friends. So we don't really know that it had much impact. And, you know, we don't have correspondence from anybody saying, oh, gee, I just read these essays by Publius. That was the nom de plume they used. And I'm going to vote for this. And it's silence. So they've survived and they are still important. And to me, they were important enough to include in this because they're so smart. And they capture the real challenges of government. And I think they give you a picture of the American experiment, which is indispensable.
In your view, what's the enduring idea from them?
Nobody's to be trusted. You know, we all in government class in high school learned about checks and balances. And that phrase, you know, I can see it if I'm talking to a group, it causes people's eyes to glaze over. You know, this is something they don't remember fondly. But it is the linchpin of our government. It is the central concept, which is no one is to be trusted. And, Congress enacts the laws, and the president can veto them, and Congress can override his veto, and the courts can strike him down, and Congress can shrink the jurisdiction of the courts, and on and on. It's like an extended game of rock, paper, scissors.
Talk about the extended game of rock, paper, scissors. The Bill of Rights, concrete as they may be, have been pushed and pulled for more than 200 years. Uh, was there an understanding that even though we had these sacred instructions, that whatever was written down would be pushed and pulled at by each successive generation?
They certainly understood that times change and perceptions change as to what's important. If you pick the Bill of Rights, I mean, it's luminescent that for our first 100 years as a nation, nobody much paid attention to the Bill of Rights. It really wasn't part of the conversation. And it took sort of modern life and deeper thinking about individual rights for them to become so central. And it was the courts that made them central. They really discovered their significance in disputes that were coming to the court. A lot of it is because as you get into the 20th century, government's doing more things. They're having more conflicts with people. And that causes people to say, hey, I've got rights. The First Amendment cases during World War I, we were throwing people who opposed the war into jail. And they said, well, wait a second, I just said it's a bad idea to go to war. I have a right to say that. And they didn't win their cases, but we started paying attention. So it took a while for, Americans to care.
There's this stirring depiction of the George Washington farewell address being drafted in the movie and play Hamilton. Play first, then movie. I actually never saw the play in person. I've seen the movie though, and it's a beautiful moment in the show. Probably the second biggest emotional moment that there is, when you put aside, or I guess leaving aside, Hamilton's own familial problems. But it is amazing when George Washington, as they put it in the show, is going home. How important was his farewell address, and what did he say that we need to remember to this day?
It was really important then, and for 100 years. In the 19th century, we made school children memorize it and recite it in
Yeah, I
class.
was. Yeah, that was amazing. You said that. Yeah, imagine making kids recite a whole speech today. I don't
Yeah,
know if
they'd be
that would
standing
happen.
there with their phones scrolling
Right.
while they read it off. And there's something to be said for memorizing. I know I'm a minority here, but you learn it in a different way if you commit it to memory. But it was something that we paid attention to as a people. We didn't necessarily do everything he told us to, but he was the guy. I said that before, but now he's not only done 8 years during the war and then the Constitutional Convention, and now 8 years as the first president. Plus, he's resigning again. He's going home again. What an amazing human being. That was the universal attitude. And so when he said something, we paid attention. And, the first three generations of Americans, there was nobody close to Washington who in the sort of public ideal. So his words had weight.
And what did he say?
Well, he said, pay your taxes. He was a practical man. He said, don't trust foreigners. They're out to take advantage of you, which is a rule we understand sometimes and not all times. Um, the most important thing for me that he kept emphasizing the importance of union. The word union appears close to 20 times in it. And he insisted that every good thing in America is going to come from your union. And then he was concerned about the partisanship that had broken out in the second term of his presidency. We had no tradition of parties, the political parties. And in his second term, suddenly we broke into the political class broke into parties. We had the Federalists who were supportive of Washington, and what were called the Democratic Republicans, who were led by Jefferson and Madison. And they really split over this somewhat goofy issue as to whether we should side with Britain in the wars in Europe or whether we should side with France, which didn't make a lot of difference to us. And that's why not Washington said no to both, and he said, he proclaimed neutrality in it. But he saw the effect it had on people. He saw it up close, and he was very troubled by that. And he talked in this farewell address about, you get alternating forces in power, first one, then the other, and each wants to wreak vengeance on the ones who came before them. And that goes on, and then both sides start to yearn for a strong man who will take power and put all this back and forth to rest. And then some strong figure, either more talented or more fortunate than his fellows, will achieve that and will destroy our republic and impose the ruins of public liberty. And that's a phrase that haunts me, the ruins of public liberty. I mean, I see Hiroshima after the nuclear bomb. I mean, that's what he was telling us. He was telling his fellow Americans at the time, but also everyone who came afterwards, you can blow this. And you can do it yourself by following pretty natural human inclinations. But it will be a terrible thing.
Jefferson's first inaugural is the final piece that you analyze here in this book. It has not gotten nearly as much attention as George Washington's farewell over the last couple 200 or so years, 230 years or so. Why has it not gotten that attention, and what do you want to shed light on by putting it in this book?
I'll answer the second question, the first question in a minute. He, we have not paid that much attention to it because there is grounds for being skeptical of what he said. By which I mean, Jefferson talked the talk, but he didn't necessarily walk the walk. He also was denouncing hyperpartisanship. And, his phrases, again, he's a luminous writer. His phrases are great. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. And he also says, we're, a difference in policy is not a difference in principle. That's a really important idea. And I included it because those are really important ideas. It's a fair question whether he lived those ideas. He was a very partisan guy. And as president, he continued being a partisan guy. So I had a bit of a inner tussle about including it, and I finally decided, all right, he said the right thing, even if he didn't live it.
All right, so we've picked up the book, we've looked at the book, we've gone all the way through it. What do you want people to do with all this? What should people take this book and bring into their public lives as they make decisions about their communities and about their states and about their country?
Use it as more of a yardstick. How do we evaluate what's going on in the country? Are these principles at the center of our public lives now? Or, are we letting corruption creep into it? Are we letting petty score settling become a driving force? Uh, we all have to answer those questions on our own. I haven't been subtle about my reaction to them, but uh, if you don't face those questions, if you don't deal with them, if you don't go out and vote, then you're the problem. And that's what I hope people appreciate, that they appreciate what we've got.
If you were going to do America 500 and 250 years, what examples would you take? What modern speeches would you take for a good volume two from our more recent history?
Oh, thank God I haven't been asked that question before. I can't, I looked and that Reagan excerpt was a good one that I was able to find. Um, I'm sure there are some good statements that I focus on the 18th century.
All
I'm not so
right.
good on this stuff.
All right. I'll let
But
you
you can
squirrel.
look at Lyndon Johnson's speech on the "We Shall Overcome," which annoyed a lot of people, but it was a very idealistic, powerful speech. There have been such speeches.
Yeah. Um, I'll let you squirrel out of that one. What public servants of today seem to embody the founding spirit in a way that accurately represents the founding ideals?
Uh, it's hard for me to identify too many. Uh, we have, uh, I mean, it's because I'm exposed to him. We have, or our Maryland congressional delegation, we have a Senator, Chris Van Hollen, and a Congressman, Jamie Raskin, who know about these things and care about them. And I think they try to abide by the principles. Uh, I'm loath to, you know, take on the rest of the world on this. Uh, I think the Bush presidents, who, I was not a great fan of, but they were honorable people and they honored our traditions and they tried to rule in consistent with those traditions. Everybody fails at something, so we shouldn't fly spec everybody, but there have been people and are people who are trying to do that. I, I don't mean to dance on anyone's grave here, but we discover that whenever a Republican loses a primary and isn't going to go back to Congress, suddenly he's a statesman. And all of a sudden he can see these things that are going wrong. And, it's nice, but it's a little late. So
Your dedication is to Flora, August, Lucy, Scarlet, Rex, and Kiki. Who are they? I mean, I have a guess as to who they are, but who are they, and why did you dedicate the book to them?
they're my grandchildren.
Okay,
Uh,
I was right about the guess. Okay.
yeah, no, I couldn't have that many with so many interesting names. And it, everything I write, I hope those kids will look at someday. But this is one that really is for them. And a big driving force for me was, what kind of country are we leaving our kids and grandchildren? I've always, been a patriot. And I traveled overseas. I would always get home and be elated in the airport. I'm back at the land of the free and the home of the brave. And honest to God, that's how I felt. And I don't now. And I miss that. And if we don't have that, I think that's a tragic thing.
Have you decided as to whether you'll do another book?
Yeah, I can't really stop.
What do you think you'll do? Do you know what you're going to take on?
I'm looking at two, and it's until I make the call, I'm not able to talk about it.
All right.
It's just
All right.
not wise.
All right. I appreciate it. David O. Stewart, the author of The Democracy We Must Keep. 7 founders, 9 documents, and the ideas that shaped America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Evan.
Check out the book and also his website, davidostewart.com. Axelbankhistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. Check out Nikki's work, and definitely go to that Patreon page to ask for your support, or we're going to ask for your support to keep the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We'll see you next time. Thanks.